Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the show. In this episode, we're taking behavioural science into the wild and looking how everyday human decision-making can be and is influenced by forces that we might not even be aware of. To process the millions of decisions we make each day, our brains take shortcuts. And people that want to influence us, like advertisers and governments, know this and find clever ways to hack those to get us to do the things they want us to do and not do the things they don't. Effective advertisers nudge us to buy products and services. Pharmaceutical manufacturers design drugs that have an effect but don't actually contain any active ingredients. City planners install traffic light buttons that aren't connected but make us feel like we're in control. And countless businesses make it incredibly easy for us to take out subscriptions and almost impossible to cancel. These tricks are everywhere. And to help me explore this, I'm joined by two amazing guests, Dr. Eva van den Broek and Tim den Heijer. Eva holds a PhD in behavioural economics and is the founder of Behavioural Insights, the Netherlands. She aims to improve policy with a better understanding of behavioural insights and is a sought-after lecturer and speaker. Tim is a creative strategist, copywriter, and founder of Brain Creatives, with 20 years of experience in advertising, working for some of the biggest brands on the planet. Together, they've written a best-selling book, originally available in Dutch, but just about to be released in English, called The Housefly Effect: How Nudge Psychology Steers Your Everyday Behaviour. If The Housefly Effect sounds like an odd title, don't worry, we get into that. Once you know why, the title makes perfect sense. In the book, Eva and Tim take their readers on a fascinating journey through everyday scenarios, from your latest Google search to the layout of supermarket shelves, revealing the unnoticed nudges that influence our behaviour. Through brilliant stories and scientific insights, the Housefly Effect not only demystifies these phenomena, but also provides practical advice on how to recognise and leverage them in your own life. And obviously, given the links to human risk, I had to get them onto the show, and I'm so pleased I did. Because in a wide-ranging discussion, you'll hear about everything from policy experiments to market campaigns, how simple visual cues can change behaviour, and why a playful approach is sometimes the best way to tackle serious issues. Tim and Eva also talk about their journey in writing the book, the dynamics of their collaboration, and why cognitive diversity is crucial for solving complex problems. I know you're going to enjoy this because it was such a pleasure to record. Eva and Tim are so insightful, so much fun, and above all, so thought-provoking. So here are Dr. Eva van den Broek and Tim den Heijer on the Housefly Effect. Eva and Tim, welcome to the Human Risk Podcast.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Happy
Great to be
here.
here.
I'm really thrilled to have you here because, as we'll come on to explore later in the show, I always love talking to people from the Netherlands about behavioural things because I think you have a really interesting angle. So we'll come back to that. But to start us off, can you tell my listeners a little bit about yourself? Let's start with you, Eva.
All right. So I'm a behavioral economist by training, but actually started artificial intelligence because, well, I guess 30 years ago or so, I thought it was a cool area to go into. And then I worked for different research institutes, really, but find all that research in the lab and all that so very artificial and theoretical. So I wanted to get out of the lab, and that's what got me into policy research, really. So I worked for a couple of ministries and then decided to do policy experiments mostly, which took me to, well, from prisoners to casinos to kindergartens to low literacy people and how to get them into the library, these kind of real life affairs. And I'm addicted to that ever since.
Wow. And Tim?
I was actually trained as a historical linguist. So when I got my master's, I had to figure out how to make a living with that. And I ended up in the wicked world of advertising, which I have had a love and hate relationship with for about 25 years now. I worked at some more traditional agencies where you're basically, a lot of your time goes into coming up with some clever idea that will win an award. I got a little bit bored with that and more interested in the side of, hey, if I build a campaign in this way, suddenly 1,000 people will start running towards the store or they won't. Which as my career advanced led me to a greater and greater interest in behavioral science. Ended up in me starting a small boutique agency specialized in combining creativity with behavioral science and figuring out how these two can actually connect rather than be at opposite ends. Yeah, that's about it.
Amazing. And obviously you've both come together with, you can see the common interest, but how did you meet and collaborate?
It's a very unlikely story, and much of it isn't we'd like to call it, like, what's that?
Benefactor?
Yeah. No, I'm looking for the arranged marriage, I guess.
True.
The kind of it really was. Like, I was talking to this publisher, and together we were thinking about books, but not really getting anywhere because I'm too theoretical, where I had two boring examples or whatever. And then he said, I think maybe you should talk to this guy that I've recently been talking to. I was like, right, a marketeer. Okay, bring it in. And there was Tim. Fun. And basically, we started off chatting, and I haven't stopped ever since. Like, we're sending WhatsApp messages every day about the things we see in daily life.
Yeah, I think a lot of the stuff that people can read in our book is very much like just being at a birthday party and being unfortunate enough to be stuck between two of us while we're discussing what we think is interesting. And so it's like a conversation, and we do exaggerate the differences a little bit in the book. I'm a bit more of the evil advertising man than I am in reality, and Eva is a little bit more rigid than she is in real life. But the two angles are complementary, and sometimes there's a little bit of tension there that we find very amusing.
I love that idea of an arranged marriage, and I think it's a brilliant example of kind of cognitive diversity done well. You've got enough that's in common, but yet these sort of not repeat versions of each other, and you're bringing very different angles on it. And I loved in the book that you played up to the characters a bit, because I think one of the things that's interesting about behaviors is we know that different perspectives, matter. If we want to solve problems, we need to have that. And so bringing in these two different perspectives that met in the middle with this interest in the subject, I thought was a really, really neat construct to illustrate, I guess, how we have to think about behavioral challenges, which is if we just think about things from one perspective, we're not going to get through to people, and we're not going to solve the problems of the world.
Oh yeah, I think we should set up what's that? Like one of these apps where marketeers and behavioral scientists can get together and have interesting conversations, because it's really interesting.
Like a dating app.
A dating app for, exactly. Yeah. I think the cool thing is I come up with this theoretical construct, and Tim kicks in the real life example, and the other way around. He's like, so what's happening here? Because I can see it working. I'm like, oh, well, I've seen that paper from blah, 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 1980. Well, whatever. So that's what working out so well. And I think you're right. Different perspectives help so much, just because people are very bad at taking different perspectives, even though they try. I mean, we all have these theories of mind and all that, but we're just really bad at that. We think other people are like us. No, he's not.
Well, and I think one other thing that really helped us to write the book was that we discovered how much fun we were having in this conversation. And as I think we were both working on proposals or ideas for books individually, I think we were both struggling with how to approach it. You can write a very angry book about behavioral economics, saying this is how people are manipulated and it's horrible. Or you can write like a guidebook. This is how you do it. And I think once we found out, we're often when we're discussing this, we're laughing at ourselves, basically. It's sort of funny that we still fall for it, and it makes us human. And you can even have a little bit of tenderness towards humankind. And we thought, oh, this is a tone that fits us. And probably people will enjoy reading about it in this way as well.
And the bit that I thought was lovely is that it reads as a very human book, right? It's fun. It's got personalities, exaggerated personalities, but still personalities in there. And I often find there's lots of books about behavioral science which almost don't demonstrate any behavioral science in the way that they're written, right? They're written sort of, it's almost like I've written a theoretical book here, and you're like, yeah, but you're trying to communicate with humans, and you seem to have missed that part, which suggests, to my mind, sometimes a lack of expertise subject.
No.
Right, it's certainly, I think we've all been to the lecture that starts with information doesn't change people's behavior, and then follows with 50 sheets of information about that. We didn't want to fall into that pitfall. So we use a lot of the effects that we describe throughout the book. For instance, the reason it's called the Housefly Effect, there are a couple of reasons, but one reason is that we wanted to apply the effect, which means that people are more interested in something when you call it an effect. So we're sort of playing around with it as well.
He had to convince me really to take on this metaphor of the housefly and the urinal. I was like, let's not, come on, we can talk about better examples of my whole fields. But no, he was right.
I have to add that if I had realized at that point that it would be an international success and there would be sequels and I would sort of be the toilet expert in the advertising industry.
Hell yeah.
Maybe I would have let Eva convince me to pick a different title, but yeah, it is what it is. Yeah.
So you alluded to it, and I know lots of listeners will know what we're talking about if we just mention the airport urinal. But there may be some that have not come across this. So I think we probably, for the reasons you've just outlined, we probably need to explain to people how you got to the housefly piece and tell the story that prompted that thought from a behavioral science perspective.
Sure. Well, I think a couple of things came together for us. One was we think that lots of stuff in behavioral science is interesting, but you can't all put it in a book and make the title stuff we think is interesting. So we had to have some sort of criterion for what goes into the book and what doesn't. And we said, well, what's really fascinating is little things that have large impact on behavior. And then we said to each other, well, what's the best example that we know of that, the most famous example? And was the fly in the urinal. It's a long story. The Dutch like to claim it. This story starts at Schiphol airport, but actually the English were there years and years and years before with a little bee in a urinal. But starting with the fly, Schiphol airport had the problem that men don't aim so well when they're standing at the urinal. Then there's something that's technically called splashback. I think we can all imagine what it is, which means that the toilets need to be cleaned. Now, this costs money. I've read some different numbers of that, but it is expensive to clean floors all the time. But more importantly, Schiphol wants to be a very good airport, very hospitable, and it's a very bad experience for a traveler when we've all been there. That you're inside the airplane and you think, well, I might go in 5 minutes, that's okay, and then the seatbelt sign goes on, and it's not going to happen before landing. And then you get out of the airport, finally there's a toilet and there's a little yellow sign saying it's closed for cleaning. Very frustrating. And what interests us about us is the way they solved it, because as an advertising guy, I would have come up with some clever, funny poster, something about I'm a pilot and I steer very precisely and you have to do the same. Or maybe in a different era, it would have been like a purpose-driven ad. We at Schiphol believe in a great experience for everyone. And then guys would have said, oh, I have to aim better because my behavior isn't fitting the purpose of Schiphol Airport. That's the way we think in advertising. We wouldn't have thought to just paint a little fly in there and guys aim at it. They don't know why, it just happens. But that last phrase, it just happens, is what fascinates us so much.
As an economist, you don't see any utility there at first sight, right? But definitely it's there.
So guys started aiming at the fly and the problem was solved. The highest number I've heard, and I'm an ad guy, so I'm going to use the highest number I've heard, that they saved with that is 40,000 euros a year. It's hard to really figure out how much cleaning one drop costs, but they definitely have made it a much smaller problem for them. So it's fascinating to us, and it's a famous example.
And I love the fact that you've picked, if you sort of said, talk to me about behavioral interventions in the Netherlands, right? It's famous globally anyway, but it's almost, in many respects, right, the poster child of it. And I love the fact that you started with it because it's a fun story. It's a little bit naughty. It's a little bit silly. And yeah, clearly it works. And I say that for two reasons. One is it's been replicated in lots of places. So there doesn't seem to be a replication crisis on this thing. And it's incredibly simple. And to your point, Tim, it defies, like it shouldn't work. It's silly. It's not a very technical solution to anything. And to your point on the measurement is we have no idea. You don't know exactly how much money, but it kind of doesn't matter. Overall, the effect is clearly it works and it improves the situation. And therefore, it's worth doing. And I love this idea that we can't necessarily put a number on it, which is why we get this wild variations of them. But that doesn't matter, right? We know there's enough anecdotal evidence there that it must work. So this is a great example of something where you don't necessarily need to have a huge amount of facts and figures, right? They've got enough evidence there, may not be quantifiable in direct terms, that this thing works. And it's really simple and it's really effective.
Yeah. No, yeah, that's the advertising story for this anecdote, really. Yeah, it works. And we don't know why. And that's a good thing about it because it intrigues people, right? And it's not that we know how exactly our brain decides where to aim for, what to aim for. It's just, this is what works, let's use it.
And especially when you contrast it to other attempts to change behavior because
Right.
it can be so hard. I've worked on campaigns for products that seemed to be just what the consumer needed, that had great distribution, great advertising, and it just didn't happen. And in 3 months, it was off the shelf. It was gone. So it can be frustratingly difficult to change behavior. And then it can be as easy as painting a little stupid little fly and solving your problem.
Well, what helps here, I think, is that people are actually they have the intention of doing the right thing, right? It's not like you're trying to suggest one.
Such a good point. No one's turning up and going, how can I right? The floor is
Sorry
mine.
for now, my languages. Yeah. So, no, but I think that really helps. We see all this, like in recent literature, there's all these things about boosting, about making people consciously overthink what actually they would be aiming for and how to construct their decisionscape in such a way that they're not relying on willpower, but on just elements of the surroundings, of the context. And I think that's what's going on here. It makes things easier. And that's basically what works. We're just lazy people. So let's make it easy.
Love that. And so we've got this famous story that you've co-opted, and as Tim, as you were explaining, it's part of the reason for the title. And so it's a great opener, right? And I love the fact that there's a bit more history to it. This isn't the first attempt. I'll let people read the book to find out about that. But where do you go from there? Because one of the things, if we looked at that famous cognitive bias codex that lists them, and I always sort of joke and say, every day a new bias is discovered, and often they just derive. How did you decide what you were going to cover? Because the breadth of what you could have covered is massive. I mean, you could have written 10 of those books and still not been done with it. How did you decide what to put in the book?
Yeah, that's a good one. So we had lengthy discussions about what to include, what not. What we wanted it to be is memorable in some way. So we wanted it to be truths that people could relate to. And I think at some point we figured out there should be a chapter on social stuff. There should be a chapter on timing elements, avoiding pain and risk and these kind of. So there were a couple of obvious ones. Then Tim came about with the attraction fly, which sort of covers like anything that would, in a choice setting, would steer your choice towards one of the options. Basically, we try to fit stuff under these umbrella terms. So,
Okay, I sort of let Eva, who's also partially a biologist, can I say that?
oh yeah,
A little bit
I have
astray.
a PhD in biology.
Exactly,
Yes.
exactly. Yeah. I never know what's touchy about that or not, but astray by coming up with 7 fake species of houseflies
Okay.
that we use, well, jokingly to have these categories. And basically, one of the reasons we have 7 categories is, hey, it worked, it fitted it, but we also know that people love 7 categories. It is a really attractive way for them to structure information. So this is another case of taking our own medicine and applying the stuff that we are also teaching in the book. Another aspect of it is that we're both public speakers, and we had both been speaking quite a lot about this subject when we started writing. So there were a lot of examples where we said, hey, I know that people always ask about this one, or that they get a really good reaction from the crowd when I present that one. So we're going to have to find a way to fit that in. And there was also something of well, they had something in common. They were often small things that seemed a little bit silly or unimportant, but there's a clever thought behind it. I know that's something you're interested in. So that helped us structure the book as well.
And before I forget, pick that theme put around things that look either basic or dumb that are actually really smart. Because one of the things I think is interesting about behavioral science is once you become aware of it, you can find it everywhere. And often actually seeing it in places where no thought's gone into the thing at all. And I love over-interpreting stuff just for fun. Like, what did they mean? And so one of the things I loved reading about was you talk a bit about situations where stuff that might seem silly or stupid or frivolous or even dumb, that's actually really smart. And there's some logic behind the madness. Can you give us an example of something there? But to talk a little bit about that, because I think that's super interesting. Is that we often think that to influence behavior, we need to be very sophisticated, do very smart things. And sometimes dumb things will work, but equally sometimes things that look dumb aren't as dumb as they seem. We just don't fully understand what's going on. There's some interesting behavioral science around that as well.
Yeah, so this was what I really loved about collaborating with Tim. I would come up with a principle like anchoring, picking a higher random number, putting that in front of people and seeing how that steers their estimates or their choices or these kind of things. And then Tim would say, oh, but I have a picture of a Vespa on an Italian restaurant menu, and the Vespa costs, I don't know, 5,000 euros or whatever. But that's just what you're saying. That's an anchor, right? That works to make the pizzas look very cheap.
Yeah,
And he's full of these kind of examples.
and what's fun about that example is exactly like you said. Probably most people looking at that menu would say, "What idiot would buy a Vespa at a restaurant? This is a really stupid idea."
Or even second level thinkers would say, oh, come on, this is not going to fool people to make them think that pizzas are cheap here. No, but yes, it does.
One example that was in the news recently is I liked the instances where also people in my own trade in advertising tend to have wrong intuitions if you compare them to science. So it's also always an easy and popular opinion to say if you have plant-based food, you shouldn't name it after meat products because it's not the same and because you don't want people to compare it to it. And it's very easy to form that opinion. But then if you look for science and try to figure out when have people actually massively changed their eating habits and what caused it, I think during one of the world wars, there was a lack of meat in the United States, and they tried to get people to eat organ meat, which was difficult. The way they did it was to make familiar recipes and substitute beef or pork for the organs. And it worked very well. And there are some other examples where this principle that everybody in my trade says, obviously this is the wrong way to go, is actually the right way to go. And I think as an advertiser and also probably as a policymaker, if your audience is underestimating how good you are at manipulating them, you have an extra superpower, really.
Yeah.
But
I first have to convince these policymakers that this actually is worth testing. So I have a harder job there, I think. No, maybe you're right.
another thing we love is, and we actually caused some fake news in the Netherlands with this, are placebo buttons. Buttons that don't do anything. We are in an office building right now. There may be one on the wall here that's just not attached to anything, but it looks like it's for the heat, right? And then there are the placebo buttons at zebra crossings. We know for a fact that there are thousands of those in New York City. And this would be, I think, for the average person, the example that they've gone crazy because they install buttons that do nothing and people are pushing them, and what idiot would do that? But the idea is that it makes it safer because people feel that they have some influence over when traffic is going to stop for them. So they wait rather than risking it and running across the street. Now, we wrote in the book when it was published in the Netherlands that this is New York. However, then one newspaper wrote about that. Another newspaper sort of copied it, but left out the New York part. And then there were actually politicians asking questions about why are we wasting taxpayers' money on fake buttons. And it wasn't our intention to spread fake news, but sometimes it happens.
What you've just hit on, both of you there, is the sort of rules of the game. So if we look at public policy, often there's got to be, you might need a number behind it, you need scientific rigor. Advertising, in many respects, works on the opposite, where you can sort of get away with stuff and it kind of, part of the game is doing stuff no one's ever done before, right? Pressing different buttons. And so bringing those two things together, it seems to me that there's room for both of those schools of thought. That obviously, if you're spending public money, although you could argue what's the difference between public money and shareholder money or I think, but if we look at those things, you sort of think, on the one hand, I sometimes wonder that perhaps advertising might be a bit free and loose, but whether that's fine if people are prepared to tolerate it. But the government don't often open themselves up to some of these more creative ideas, right? It all has to be pegged about, prove to me this works before you can do it.
Yeah.
And I guess less imaginative clients, Tim, who are not going to be, not your clients, right, but less imaginative, are going to have the same logic. There seems to be this strange thing that on the one hand, we viscerally know that weird things, odd things, strange things delight us and we pay attention to them. On the other hand, there's also this sort of like, well, we need to be able to justify it. We need to be able to do it. And there's a strange thing there, which seems to be we sometimes get fundamentalism in both ways. And we kind of need to bridge that gap a little bit because I think there's room for both.
So that's funny because, well, we just seem to have right now in the Netherlands an asylum crisis that someone just made up. If you look at the numbers, there's no such thing. So numbers and policymakers and politicians, well, not sure that's a different league or a different kind of game than advertising. But I do think policymakers are generally very risk averse. They have this kind of theory of mind about their bosses, and they seem to want to think that their bosses understand that it's a good idea before they set out to test it in real life. So I spend a lot of time actually doing science advocacy or so, like look at the numbers, we know this works, yes, let's test it in the whole, to policymakers, since it's super tough to convince them to do something new. So yes, you're on something.
Yes, and also success is measured differently. I've won advertising awards for getting a conversion of 13%. This means that in 87% of the people who saw the ad did absolutely nothing. Maybe they hated it. In advertising, that's great. 13%. And actually, the jury said, well, we didn't want to give you this award because we didn't like the idea, but the results were so good that we felt we had to. And that's 13%. So advertising is a different world than policy, I think. If you can save 13% of lives with some health thing, sure, it's good, but it's not what you're looking for. I think another thing that it has in common is that there's the principle and there's the way you apply it. So, for instance, what we see is a lot of municipalities in the Netherlands are starting to think from behavior, but they will find a certain insight and apply it very literally. So they will basically put up a sign. They want to use social proof. So they say, most people in this park throw their litter in the bin. Okay, that's one way to do it. Whereas you see in marketing, for instance, we have a famous bicycle leasing company in the Netherlands that wanted to make leasing a bicycle a little bit more normal. So they gave their bikes blue front tires, making it very visual. This was a different way to say more and more people are leasing their bicycle rather than buying it. But they didn't literally say it. They found a creative way to imply it. And I think that's where probably there's a lot more potential, both for advertising and for policymakers, to use a principle that's been proven, that's robust, but use it in an interesting way that also catches the attention and maybe doesn't have the wear out of, I know this trick by now.
There's beautiful examples from policy as well. I'm right now I'm thinking of these big orange bins that are meant for plastic garbage, and they actually have this kind of look through hole in there, so you can see that actually your neighbors are contributing to this
Social
goal. So I think what's the word for it? Not implementing it in a literary way is definitely, for the Dutch at least, works better than putting the sign with most of your neighbors are doing already.
Richard Shotton, who I think has been a guest of yours,
He has, yeah.
calls it the literal and the lateral approach. And I think that's a very good way to put it. Yeah.
And I think it is really interesting when we look at the term replication crisis. I'm not sure why it's a crisis, because it seems obvious to me that if you do something in a university context, in a very sort of artificial setting, that we shouldn't be surprised that doesn't necessarily carry across to the real world where there's other things going on, and let alone to other countries or other contexts. And so I like this idea that you sort of pointed out, which is to say, if we identify that we're onto something, there is a dynamic here that has an impact. And this is what I think your book is sort of pointing towards, going, there's stuff we can play with, right? What we shouldn't be doing, implicit in what you've just been saying, and your point around Richard's comment as well, is we shouldn't be just slavishly going, oh, this is a way to do it, like a recipe. We should be freestyling with a bit and saying, here's a dynamic that we might be able to do something with and might fail terribly. Let's recognize that as well. But here's a dynamic, and we should be thinking really intelligently about how we do that. And I think this idea of sort of, just in the same way that if we just slavishly follow recipes, it won't always produce the amazing food. It'll produce something. But I think we can just think much more creatively. And so what I loved about your idea of the way you talk about these things is this isn't a book where, well, you need to follow this checklist. It's not the Housefly checklist, right? It's the effect. And you're saying, I viewed it, and I'd be interested in whether this was the intent, but I viewed it as sort of like, oh, that's interesting. Let me think about that. What ideas does that give me? It's a creative jumping off point that's based in science. So I've got an evidence. It's a good place to start playing. And then let's just play with it and see what happens. But we shouldn't expect the things that you've described to necessarily carry even into the identical environments. And once it might not work, but particularly if we're shifting environments. But what you're encouraging people to do is just to go, here's something to play with.
Yep.
Have a think about this. And therefore, that's a good start point.
Yes, we're hoping it to be a conversation between the two of us that starts to include you as a reader, where you're also thinking about it. One example that we have discussed a lot is the famous 6 jars of jam sell more than 24 jars of jam. Now, what conclusion are you going to draw from that? If you're in the jam selling business and you're doing it at a stall in front of the store, you could just literally say, okay, so I need to have 6 kinds of jam. Done. I think it's much more interesting to say, okay, so there's a point where giving people more options starts to work against you. Why might that be? Is it also true in my situation? Can I test that? Can I test what's going on with the difference between the options? Does it work as much if those options are more alike? Or so to really take something like that as a starting point and try to figure out what's going on. Maybe if I was working for a jam company, I would say you need to make a line of 6 jams. Maybe this has to be your whole business model. But you can make these insights so much bigger than the way many businesses are just like literally applying like Cialdini principles, saying, okay, we'll do an A/B test of social proof and authority, and we'll see let the computer decide what sells best, and we're done with it. That curiosity is the interesting part of it.
Yeah. We don't really feel to like pretending that we know where to go, as in that you find the answer. It's just like, yeah, do try this at home. Do start experimenting with these things.
And speaking of experimenting, before we were recording, I was saying to you that I love having conversations with Dutch people about behavioral science, particularly those that know what they're talking about, because it seems to me, and I'm recognizing fully, this might be my confirmation bias and the fact that I love going to the Netherlands and looking at I'm more alert to it, so I'll probably spot more of them. But there seemed to be something in the Dutch psyche that means you're more willing to try things out. In other words, I can spot more things in the Netherlands that I think are interesting from a behavioral perspective. And we've seen things like the sort of the table of 11 that was brought into government. Before you can implement something, you need to think about the behavioral dynamics. So there seems to be something there. Ignoring the fact that, of course, I'm biased, is there anything you can sense in the national psyche that means that, I don't know, experimentation's more permitted or something like that might help explain my perception?
Well, I think the Dutch, and especially we're recording this in Amsterdam, that's even a city that's even infamous for that within Holland. Everybody has some reactance to rules and regulations, but the Dutch almost have an allergy to them and tend to, basically not do as they're told. Even
like there's more people crossing the zebra crossings with red light than with green light. Because it's safer somehow, yeah.
So I think especially policymakers, have sort of accepted that they can put up a sign and say you get a fine if you do this or that, but people will do it anyway, and they don't have the capacity to give everybody a fine. So they will have to find other ways to influence behavior. I think a great example that I really love is behind our central station. There's an area where basically there are no traffic rules. It basically have said there were rules there, then a lot of accidents happened because people didn't play by those rules or follow those rules. So they just removed all the rules and said, you're all grown people, figure it out.
Well, there's kind of hints towards what the behavior ideally should look like. There's this red area and this green area, and people seem to understand that you stand still in the red area and start walking towards the ferry in the green area. So there's suggestions, light suggestions. And that's what the Dutch like, I guess.
But again, I'm probably looking for this, but it also, it strikes me that when you do this, there's always a sense of fun associated with that. If you were thinking too literally, back to your Richard literal lateral thing, you'd probably sort of, I don't know, we'd be trying to rely on something a bit more, hard evidence. Whereas it seems to me that when we introduce some of the behavioral ideas that you talk about, whether that's nudging or whether that's going more broadly, that there is an element of fun here. There's a kind of like, I don't quite know if this is going to work, but we're going to try. We're going to test something out to see what happens. And that always strikes me as coming with I don't know, maybe this is just me looking for it again, is that there's always a little bit of a smile, a little bit of a human, curiosity with it.
I think the curiosity definitely comes into it. We had a big traffic experiment in Amsterdam this year, where basically a main road was closed off for traffic, and the city said, well, let's see what happens if we do that. Not everybody in the city thought it was a lot of fun.
Picking on reactants, yeah.
Yeah, but I think the mentality of, models can't really tell us what happens if we do it. Let's just see. Yeah, it feels sort of natural for a city like this.
Well,
Maybe not for the whole
I'm
country.
not sure I agree. Maybe that's an Amsterdam thing, but talking to national policymakers, what you see is actually, yeah, I guess rather something else. They would use the word experiment as like we brush the idea off the table, but let's, yeah, you go play in your whatever province, do it at small scale, and then in 2 years' time, we'll never get back to it. So I have the feeling that actually this experimenting is really a dirty word. I'm trying to turn that word itself into something that, yes, alludes to curiosity and trying things out instead of something dirty that you don't want to inflict on people. So do it in a dark corner. I'm not sure about it.
Maybe thinking about it, would you agree, Eva, that our bodies of government are often looking for new and different ways to do something? Maybe sometimes to a fault, but aren't very conservative in we should keep doing this because we've been doing this for a long time. If you look, for instance, at education.
Well, in education, that's a very specific topic. I think, at least in the Netherlands, there are people are trying out so many new things that it's a waste of money in itself. Basically, they're like evidence-based. You'd expect there were one department that would work evidence-based and science-based, but no, they don't. I think actually people are very conservative.
But a little joke about this from a Belgian friend of mine. I don't know if I'm telling it correctly, but he said when Germans come up with a rule, they follow it. When Belgians come up with a rule, they find a way to bend it. And when the Dutch come up with a rule, they immediately start a committee to figure out if they should change it.
Yeah. I'm thinking how the Japanese fit into this, actually. That's like it.
You originally wrote the book, obviously, for your national audience. It's now getting the international publication that it truly deserves. Have you, when you were changing and writing not writing the English edition, but sort of reviewing it, translating it, were there things that you needed to change? Was there a lot, or was it, because I'm struck by, on the one hand, when we think about behavioral science, it's universal, right? It's the human condition. And it's the airport, the story that started it all illustrates, right? There are things that pun intended, travel really well. But what were the sort of differences between when you were talking to a Dutch-only audience and maybe talking to a global audience?
Well, it's really interesting to us that when we were writing it, there was a lot of people were writing about how behavioral science was weird in capitals, and how we didn't really know how it worked in different cultures, and probably it was very much biased towards Western culture, etc. So yeah, that was one thing on our minds when we were writing it. And then we were really surprised, for instance, for the Japanese edition, which did much better than the Dutch edition. We changed very little. We removed some jokes about Donald Trump.
The whole housefly concept is thrown out in the Japanese edition because, of course, they have different urinals. They don't have to aim, these Japanese. So the whole fly concept was completely Well,
they still describe it in the book, yeah.
Yeah, but the publisher was like, no, we're not going to put that on the...
But most of the examples, biases, heuristics we described there, we've also been there and done a bunch of interviews. People recognize that they smile at the same things we smile at. So I was pleasantly surprised that it was more universal than I feared. But
yeah, well, there's obviously big cultural differences in how these biases and houseflies play out, right? So the Japanese would go for... There's these famous experiments about, say, you're asking people to fill in a questionnaire or something, and then the actual experiment is about what color of pencils they choose from a big bunch of red and blue pencils. And then what a Japanese person did more often in that experiment was choose the color that there were more pencils left of, whereas the Dutch one would, of course, or I forgot, the American, English, whatever, would go for the scarce resource, for this one final red pen or so. So definitely that's the same kind of brains and the same kind of biases that we have. We look at what other people have done, will do, might do, but it plays out differently. And I think there's lots of examples in our book that actually might totally not work in a different country.
And also the other way around, sometimes we in our Dutch book, we were telling Dutch readers, here's this really funny example from Japan that you will be surprised at. And then Japanese people were like, yeah, well, we knew that. So, of course, the fact is fruit is very expensive there because you can give it as a gift, for instance. It's very surprising to Dutch people who like to eat an apple on the street, but not surprising to a Japanese audience.
And I love that idea that, I mean, talking about scarcity there, that's a really good illustration around one culture will, I guess, act in a more pro-social way, right? So you'll leave choice for other people, whereas the other is looking more at, like, I'll take the thing that's seemingly most valuable because it's most scarce. But underpinning both of those things is a recognition that there is some understanding of limitations of resources. It's just a different reaction to the same dynamic. So I think that's a lovely illustration of saying, okay, you may play it a different way, but we all intuitively understand this idea that we don't have unlimited resources, and therefore there is value to be had. Now, the question is, do I take the value? Do I share the value? How do I react to that situation? But that's a really good illustration of the point you're making here, which is you're looking at buttons we can press, exactly what the effect of that button will be, and whether it's worth pressing as hard in some areas as others is to be tested. But that's really the illustration of what you're talking about here, is let's pick these common dynamics, highlight some things that we see going on, and then over to the reader, if you like, in a way, to think about how does that apply in their world.
Exactly. And sometimes it's the exact same principle, but in a different culture, it has a slightly different shape. So in a Japanese meeting, it would hurt your social standing if you didn't show that you understood the hierarchy. And in a sense, even though Dutch culture is very different, it's the same. Only it would hurt our social standing if we were too humble towards our superiors. And it would hurt their social standing if they weren't humble enough towards their superiors. But it's basically a different twist on the same principle.
I kept reading it and I was thinking, there were lots of things I'd come across before. And I love, in a way, I felt like I was reading it. I was like, in a way, there's some bits of it that I found were like greatest hits that I sort of expect to see there, right? The start point is a classic example of that. There's the Van Moof, I'm never sure if it's Van Moof or Van Moof, box where they transported bicycles in boxes with TVs on the side to give the idea it was a television and people take more care of it. So there's those sorts of classic hits. But then there were quite a few things where it was always lovely because there were some things I recognized. I went, yeah, cool, glad they've covered that. And then I was like, whoa, what was that new thing I just read? And there was one that I really want to pick out, was this idea that because people are lazy, you talk about the getting change for the laundrette, I think it was. And there was this insane, but can you just tell that story? Because I read it and I was like, I almost didn't believe what I was reading. It was absolutely, like, even to the extent of knowing that you're going to pick crazy stories. This was mad.
Yeah, there was a startup in, I think, the United States called Washboard. We say it right? Anyway, people need quarters for laundrettes. And what you could do is basically have a subscription where they would send you quarters. Or you would overpay massively for those quarters. So you would buy like $30 worth of quarters for $50. And people actually thought, well, that's very convenient. Let's do that. And
Those things only shock economists, right? Normal people think, yes, of course, I do that. At least that's what I would say.
I think what I liked about it was that it was so clearly a bad financial decision, and people just didn't care and subscribed. Yeah.
I presume the business isn't still going, but
they ran into trouble, and our little joke is that we hope it had something to do with money laundering, but probably didn't.
But that's a good illustration of, okay, there's a basic economic thing that we ought to understand, right? It's not hidden in any way, shape or form. There's lots of businesses out there where it's kind of like you are being ripped off, but it's not obvious. When I look at something like that, I just go, that is staring you in the face, because we're talking about you're handing over cash and you're getting cash back. It's not like you're handing over cash and getting some, I don't know, crypto intangible. It's literally a cash for cash exchange. Yep. And yet that still manages to fool people.
I love these casino little notices that sort of seem to compete with other casinos, saying, hey, here, your, what is this, reward to the player or whatever, return to player is 9.7 instead of only 9.6. Whereas obviously it should be 10 to 10, right? I mean, you're handing over, well, anyway, but people seem to...
I think, as a side note, that we, in certain countries, especially in the Netherlands, we are starting to see this thing you just described, where cash money is seen as a token. Like, I have this gift token that I need to spend on something because we're so.
What is this weird thing, right?
So maybe people were looking at the quarters as laundrette tokens, basically, rather than cold hard cash. Yeah.
That's super interesting. One of the things that all three of us share is this sort of, you walk through the world with a kind of interesting pair of glasses on, right? Looking through a behavioral lens. And I wondered, are you able to switch that off? Because I struggled with that, right? I like, to the extent that I will go out of my way to photograph things, to inspect things. I will make myself late for stuff. And my partner, she's very understanding, but occasionally she goes, "What are you doing?" And I'm like, I'm just looking at this sign. She's like, "It's just a sign." And I'm like, "No, but this is really important." And sometimes I'll take a picture, like 5 years later, I'll work out why it's important. I'm assuming you have the same thing, right? It's utterly, I find it like it's exhilarating, but it's exhausting because every single trip out of the door becomes a safari where you might come across. And I wondered if that's the same for you. I'm guessing it is.
I love the word safari. That's basically how I look at the world. Yes, look what they are doing here. Look the behavior they're displaying or the kind of signs they put up. Yeah. Luckily, I have Tim to send these pictures to because my partner's totally set up with that. Yeah.
Actually, I love going on holiday. I don't gamble at all. I don't drink a lot or party a lot, but I love to go on holiday to Las Vegas just for the safari aspect of it. And same goes for certain areas of Tokyo. I really like the parts of society where we're really overdoing it. If I'm switching channels and there's this we call Telcel. I don't know if you have it, like very commercial, selling products on
late nights.
I like it like a shopping channel, basically, where the whole purpose of the show is to sell stuff.
Especially like that. So and they'll have something like a multifunctional remote control. I'll just be happy all day just for that phrase. Like, so what remote control only has one function, but now you get with free multifunctional remote control. So I love these excesses of it. They just make me happy in a weird way. But we actually organize safaris, monthly, as we call it, housefly safaris in the Netherlands, where we take marketeers or policymakers basically through town and give them a little bingo card and say, cross off all these different aspects of behavioral influence that you can find in the street. And show us your example. So we actually teach that weird thing that we have to also spread it. Yeah.
And you're so right, because taking off those glasses is very hard. On the other hand, we had interviews with I don't know, newspaper journalists that took us to supermarkets and we were pointing out stuff. And then I would get out with these fried cheese, new, now different color kind of, I don't know, snacks. So I'm so susceptible to all these things, even though we're on it, right?
Yeah, I think we're all very good at turning that curiosity off when it comes to something that we want ourselves. You know, if I'm buying a new laptop, then all of a sudden I'm completely blind to all of this.
But you know what's even worse is I spot it and I'm kind of proud of the fact. I go, I see what they're doing, right? But I'm still going to buy it. And it's kind of like, it's almost like it becomes a thing. And particularly where I'm buying stuff for my business, right? I kind of go, oh, well, this is on brand, right? This is good. The investment committee of one approves of this, right? Because it's the behavioral science has been cleverly deployed. I'm now by this. So I'm kind of like, far from being embarrassed by it, I'm actually proud. So I sort of look at it and go, oh, that was good, right? That's good. That's helped it. That's research for me, right? To see how susceptible people are. And so it's displayed. I don't ever think that one can make oneself immune to it. Because, you know, even Kahneman and people like that were always well known for saying, like, it gets all of us because it works on a visceral. He said it much more eloquently, but it gets all of us because it works on a visceral level. And I don't know, I kind of like almost feel like I'm just tipping my hat a little bit to them and just go, that's clever. Yeah, and always sort of go, I don't understand what's going on here, but it works, right? So I'm going to buy the product anyway, because like all credit to you for whatever it is.
Just so well done that you have, yeah, I recognize that very much. Although there are a couple of products where I'm really appalled by how manipulative they are selling it, like things that try to avoid regulation, say selling an insurance that you can't aim at only higher educated people, but they're calling it PhD or so. So it's only in a name, and of course that's allowed, and it feels like only people with higher education are allowed to take it on. But of course that's forbidden, so everyone could take it on, but still they reap the benefits of the suggestion. And these kind of things I really despise.
And that's a really interesting, and particularly maybe for you, Tim, is I'm fascinated where the limits are on this. And you touch on this in the book around ethics. And I think, there's a point where, and I always sort of say, just because you can doesn't mean you should, right? There's lots of behavioral tricks that we could pull.
Exactly.
And there's a limit there. And I think and that's a great example of a sort of extreme thing where, as you were talking, my mouth was open because I'm like, clearly that is going against the spirit of the law.
Yes.
Right. It doesn't matter what the technicality is. You should not be doing that. And you kind of know that because that's where it's not, oh, we didn't realize, right? You're doing that deliberately.
I think that's part of a bigger problem that people tend to look at behavioral change as a short-term one-off, get people to do stuff, make some money of it, or get your results, and you're done kind of thing. I used to work for Heineken, the beer brand. And in Netherlands, there's a lot of regulation on what a beer brand can and cannot do. That comes from the beer industry itself. They're pretty good at self-regulating. And if you're a creative working on Heineken, then the first thing you need to learn would be a great slogan for
Very
Heineken.
good.
Yeah, is that you don't want to find the loopholes in that regulation. You don't want to look for, but we can get away with it if we do it this way. You want to stay well within the regulation and be creative there, because otherwise in the long term it's going to be very bad for the brand. And I think this goes for a lot of, especially what Eva just described. It can be clever in the short run, but it's not clever in the long run. And you really need to keep your end game in mind when you're applying all these little houseflies to see, okay, this is helping me reach my short-term goals, but is it also in line with my long-term goals?
I love that. I love that formulation. And I was thinking, actually, as you were talking, because I spent half my time in Munich, half in London, and I'm in Munich at the moment. We just had Oktoberfest as we're recording this. And obviously that's a similar thing, right? Is you have the purity law, which is set up by in effect, it's self-regulation, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that basically, and you're right, that's an absolute do not touch this under any circumstances. And I haven't thought about the fact that the creative mind would take you to some interesting places, right? We're going to play. Why don't we play with that, right? That seems like a natural place to play. But actually, to your point, that's an interesting way of, I guess, creativity requires constraints. So I guess with the way you were just talking about it is you would add that to that's just a constraint on us, and that can help keep creativity, right? Because it boxes us in on the one hand, but then that can help us.
I love it. We should make it explicit and make up a Reinheitsgebot for the marketing signs. I love it.
The other thing, this is me projecting, but I'm going to try this because I think this will work, is that one of the things that you talked about things that you find nefarious, and that I'm still riled by that insurance, even though it's nothing to do with me. Right, it's a different country, different thing. I'm unlikely to buy it. Why am I bothered by it? I'm bothered by it viscerally in the same reason you are, right? It just feels wrong. Do you do what I do, which is if I come across something that I think is really, like, I go for it. I will waste a ton of time fighting ridiculous processes that I think are exploitative. So, for example, the people that won't let me cancel a subscription.
Oh, yeah.
Right. I'm going to go to war with that.
Yeah.
And I'll go to war on things that, and even if I don't have a subscription, right, if I've got a way of fighting the machine, because I look at it, I think it's my duty, if I understand this stuff and I have the intellectual capability, questionable, but let's go with that, and the time, and I can justify the time because it's kind of my job, I pursue this stuff because I'm really angry. There's a little bit of vigilantism on my part when I come across stuff that just like feels wrong.
Please send them to us. We'd love to have them, like wherever.
We actually have our own little award in the Netherlands that we invented. I don't know if I'm correct.
A dunkfly?
Dunkfly? Do you have a dunkfly, like a fly?
Oh, dunkfly. Yeah.
Which we give to companies that apply behavioral science in despicable ways.
Mm-hmm. And there's, of course, the golden housefly as well. I mean, we do want to, the feeling that you were just describing, like you're selling me this so well, we want to reward that. Yes, we recognize that too. But the dunkfly is what, of course, really attracts the attention.
So tell me about, how does that work? So people submit things to you. How do you judge what's bad? I'm fascinated by, like, because clearly there'll be a category of things that are terrible, but how do you decide?
So
let's call it what it is. How do you decide what the shittiest thing
There's
is?
a very knowledgeable committee of 2 people, and they list all the examples that we collected and got sent in and all that. And then we put them basically along these 2 axes with how avoidable is it? So can people get away, or can people sort of withdraw from this dirty, mean trick by us exploiting whatever? And how transparent is it, what the company or the policy or whatever is after? So is it obvious that they're trying to get you into I don't know what, and that they're doing it by this and that mechanism? And these 2 axes, I think, if they're both falling out on the wrong side, let's say, then we have a very high potential award winner for the Decaply.
Yeah, but it's presented on radio, and then the way we describe it there is if a company is extremely good at doing something extremely bad, then they
Okay,
then
that's
win
great.
it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so what's the latest winner? How does give us an example?
So the latest winner was, what are they
Prime.
called again? Prime. Yeah, perhaps you know it in the UK as well. It's this energy drink that was
Oh, yeah.
sold basically by means
I
of...
thought you were about to attack Amazon Prime, and I was like, well, that's
No, no.
interesting. But
Oh.
no. I know that
Oh,
the over...
can I do
Right.
that afterwards, please?
Yeah, please. Go for it. But let's deal with the energy drink yeah, okay.
Yeah, so basically they were selling it by this effect that's called the Romeo and Julia effect. It was actually forbidden, I think, at least for kids.
Yeah, one version was forbidden because it had too much caffeine.
Yeah, it was really unhealthy. And of course, that only added to the attraction that it has to kids to buy these things illegally. And it was easy to get, at least in the Dutch market, also in big shopping streets, also online. It was everywhere. They were selling it. I don't know how much was.
14 euros a can.
Yeah. Amazing. So we wanted to expose that, basically.
Yeah, and that's interesting because based on what I know of it, it just struck me as being extremely exploitative. From what I can tell, a terrible product, right? Nothing redeeming about it at all. And actually, that's interesting because Prime was a limit for me because I was like, why are people buying this? Well, the curious side of me was like, I need to find out more.
Well, so it plays really into this teenage mind, I think.
Yeah. And then I was like, it doesn't appeal to me in any way, shape, or form, which is exactly the point, right? That was a limit too far. I was like, I'm not going to spend money on this thing because it doesn't speak like, I don't know, it just didn't feel right. So you've just brilliantly tested out the limits of my willingness to applaud this stuff.
No, actually, if we want to keep teenagers from drinking it, we should probably hire a bunch of people our age and have them walk around shopping streets where they keep urinals Prime. That might solve the problem right away.
Good point.
Okay, so that was that. Brilliant. Okay, well-deserved winner, in my opinion. I don't know what the other entrants were, but I don't care, right? I agree. That's a pro-social award that you just given there. Brilliant. Tell us about Amazon Prime, because you reacted to that.
So that's a very specific thing. So they were in the neighborhood park around here. There was this big billboards that Amazon was actually putting up. And they read something like 56% of the women in this neighborhood have been harassed. Amazon Prime. And I was like, okay, Amazon Prime, you are now using social proof to actually make it very clear that in this neighborhood it is the norm. What are you doing exactly? I guess their team has tried to come up with something very gentle to say, guys, this is a big problem. We should be shocked. But we know that these kind of statements actually have the opposite effect, right? This means that people feel that, women or people that are more likely to be arrested get more scared, and the other way around. Men who would be contemplating harassing someone would actually, get the idea or some kind of an extra validation or so for it.
Yeah, I think
It's so much the wrong idea.
I think they were asked for a show they have on Amazon Prime that is about harassment. Yeah. But they went down that infamous path that you really don't have to go down anymore, because most people in the business should know this, where they think we're going to prove how big the problem is by showing big numbers. And we know it always backfires. I've seen this myself, research on campaigns about discrimination, where people see numbers like 90% of people with a certain background encounter discrimination. And their reaction to the numbers is, well, I shouldn't complain then because it's just a fact of life. And you're trying to get them riled up to do something, and it works exactly the opposite way. So yeah, this is, and it never stops. There's another campaign doing this every week. I was in the movie theater with my 14-year-old daughter, and the lights dim, and the first commercial says, more and more teenagers are vaping. I'm like, is this a vaping commercial? But it was an anti-vaping commercial.
Oh, shall we nominate them?
Yeah.
Oh dear.
That's amazing.
Beautiful.
But the incredible about that is, and the things you've talked about, and sure, of course, like we're talking about, and I said, there were tons of campaigns and advertisements that don't do this, right? We're focusing on the negative, but that's more fun. But what fascinates me is that still now, in spite of all the things that we know, right, you don't have to be an expert in behavioral science or marketing or anything to spot the sorts of things that you've talked about. And yet we still see these, I'm going to call them basic errors, right? Just things that are just like, I don't know, it's not, because I would expect us now, with the knowledge that we have, to be making more sophisticated mistakes, right? Sort of stuff that's almost like you stumble across something unexpected. This ought to work, but it doesn't, right? But if we look at it, there are still these basic errors there. And I get that individuals might make basic errors, but when you look at organizations, and whether that's governments or whether that's advertisers, spending a ton of money to screw up in a really public way, I find that astonishing.
Yeah, why do we have a law department and a financial department and not this behavioral department that sort of screens things for the biggest errors? I love that. And that's what you're saying about the commercial parties as well.
Yeah.
Right?
I do have a bit of an explanation for some of these social proof errors, which is, for instance, if you're an organization that has some very good ideas and you want to, for instance, make sure that kids will read more, and you will need some funding for that, and you will need the government to get behind that. You will have to prove that it's a big problem. Otherwise, you won't get the funding, the government won't be. So for a large part of your campaigns behind the scenes, you will be saying, this is terrible, kids are reading less and less. But then you have to make a very hard turn once you start broadcasting to kids and not tell them kids are reading less and less, kids. So I think it's where it goes wrong is when you make the switch from convincing policymakers, politicians, journalists that this is an important issue to when you start to actually try to change behavior.
Which proves the point that it's not, in a way, the analysis is the logical bit. If we wanted to sort of look at it in Kahneman terms, right, we'd be saying the system 2 analysis goes on behind the scenes. You need to then hit the public with a system 1 campaign.
Yes.
And actually what you've done is you've hit it with a system 2 in very simple terms. I think that's a really interesting way of looking at it.
Also in politics and these kind of settings, of course, because,
You could also say that it's system 1 for politicians to think, okay, this is about big numbers. This is an important issue. So a politician's system 1 may work a little bit differently than the effort versus system 1 there. But yeah, you still see these mistakes, and they don't need to be made. And of course, this runs a little bit counter to what we discussed earlier about don't make it a rule book and figure stuff out. There may be some case we don't know about yet. I think, for instance, Wikipedia, they say only 2% of our visitors.
Which breaks all the rules, and everybody goes, they're idiots. Now, clearly it must work, otherwise they wouldn't be doing it.
But as it turns out, it does work for them, or they're very stubborn.
I don't care what the evidence says, right? I love that. It's a fundamentalist approach, right? Eventually they will come round to it, right? But in the meantime, we've got enough money.
So I try to sort of work against this fundamentalist approach in policy arenas every now and then by asking people to put down a prediction, a numerical prediction on what kinds of interventions would create what or how big of an effect. And that sort of seems to help, because then the manager or the boss really has to estimate what they think the effect will be of the different kinds of interventions or variants that you're trying out. And that really makes people consider very much what they think will work and afterwards be interested in the outcome. So I think it's actually a nice way of working around that kind of fundamentalist approach.
I love that. I could keep talking to you both forever, but as time has fallen, I don't know where the time has gone, but I've had an amazing conversation with you. You clearly get on, you clearly bring complementary skills. What's next in the collaboration?
So we have big plans, of course, because these WhatsApps, pictures of signs have to go somewhere. No. So what we did in Dutch was make a children's book out of this grown-up book, so to say. And that was actually even more fun to write. That was so nice to put these things into a very, like, say for a 9 or 10-year-old's mind, to make it understandable and make them able to apply it to their parents. So how do you manipulate your parents is basically the story behind that book. And that was so much fun to write, really.
I love that, because normally when I'm talking to people about behaviors, I always drop in the reason you should listen to me is because this isn't just useful at work. And typically I'm talking to compliance and risk people. Not just useful for how do you influence the employees. You can use this at home if you have kids.
So,
And I casually talk about, of course, kids are using, they're using influence techniques on us. I was not aware there was a book that allowed them to do this. So I love the idea that you're equipping kids to handle this stuff from an early age, right? That's absolutely. But on a more serious note, I think there's something interesting in effect what the book is telling you, sort of unpicking techniques that are happening all around us. And so you're pointing very much in the direction of critical thinking, and we need to think about what has an effect and the surprising things that impact us and things that we can use on other people. But that points us very much to, if we look at the sort of the world of fake news and misinformation, a lot of the things you're pointing out towards is to give people a basic education in some of the things that they might not be aware of are influencing their decision-making. And I love this idea that, in effect, what you've just said is teaching, it's different context, right? But you're teaching critical thinking to kids. It's like, just be a bit more questioning about why you're making decisions you're making, and this is how we're influenced. I think that's becoming so important, particularly in the current political context, but we can, with AI and those things, that seems to me to be a core skill. So I love that you've done that, but I really think the work, what you're pointing towards is very strongly plays into that as well.
yeah, actually, it's even worse. We, inspired by other scientists, we included one page in which we teach them how to make their own fake news and how to sell it to other people so that they're getting better at recognizing it. And I really love that part. Yeah.
Wow.
That's fake news about your teacher.
Yeah. So step 1, step 2.
I'm going to get hold of a copy of this. I love this. I just love this as a concept. What a brilliant idea. Remind people what the book is called in English, so because they're going to want to read this. This is amazing. Tell us what it's called.
So our English publisher is called the Housefly Effect. We were in doubt whether we're calling it what kind of titles do we have? The housefly, the blowfly. There's all these kinds of types of flies, it appears, but the Housefly Effect is what we called it in the end.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about that is that in Dutch it's called the Bromvlieg effect, which I think would translate literally as blowfly, because Bromvlieg is a really nice sounding Dutch word to Dutch people. But it's also the wrong kind of fly. It's not the actual fly that's in the bowl. So housefly, I think, is the correct term for it. So actually, the British are the first country to get a correctly titled book.
It's that kind of attention to detail, Tim, that I think is critical in what you do.
Anyway, it's called the Housefly Effect. Bedford Square is the publisher.
Yep.
Amazing. Well, there will be links to that in the show notes. But I want to say thank you for a fabulous conversation. I've loved it. As I mentioned to you before we started recording, you are two people that I have been wanting to chat to for ages because I just love what you do. And individually, you would have been great. Together was amazing because you just bounce off each other in such a lovely way. And so thank you for writing what is absolutely a fabulous book. I will check out the kids' book and I'll put a link to that in the show notes as well. But just thank you for being you and just bringing some amazing humor and insight into this fabulous field. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Well, thank you so much for this conversation because it was a joy to have it with you. Thanks.
So that's it for this episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Eva and to Tim for appearing and to you for listening. To find out more about Eva, Tim, their fabulous book, The Housefly Effect, How Nudge Psychology Steers Your Everyday Behavior, and the work that they do, have a look in the show notes. There are links to those there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, thank you so much for joining me. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. If you like the show and have yet to leave a review for it, please do wherever you download it. It really, really does help. To discover some of the over 300 episodes of the show that you might have missed, visit the show's website, which is humanriskpodcast.com. I will be back very soon with another episode of the show. But in the meantime, take a look out for houseflies wherever you might find them. And thank you so much for listening.